Welcome back to part 2 of the lecture. I'll be talking briefly about some of the different forms of debate to give you some idea for the overarching structure that you might adopt for using debate in history classroom, and then in part 3 we'll talk about some of the practicalities of actually planning a sequence of activities to lead up to a debate and how you might run a debate more effectively in the classroom. So the first thing to say about thinking about the form of debate is that some debates tend to open up the issue to interpretation of just one or another perspective. So the traditional "this house believes" kind of formal debate encourages people to argue either that it does believe that or that it doesn't. It's a for or against, and you tend to focus on the extreme positions. There's a whole grey area in between which is likely to be underexplored when you have these kind of debates. The opposite is to have a more of a deliberative discussion where the whole thing is framed to encourage people to explore the centre ground, but obviously that holds up the other possibility that you spend all your time focusing on shared areas of interest and interpretation and ignore some of the more extreme views. So there are some good reasons why we might be sceptical that one or other form of debate is going to meet all of our teaching needs, and why ultimately we'll probably need to plan a balance of activities over the year. Say something about the competitive debates. This would be a traditional layout. This is the kind of thing that you see frequently in handbooks for debate competitions in schools and university. You have a chair to keep order and a timekeeper to keep people to time. You have 3 main speakers for the proposition who will argue for the motion, and 3 people on the opposition who will argue against it. These roles are largely assigned, so we're not looking for people who are really for and against it. We're just going to assign this as a role that people have to assume they have to research that role. We are also likely in a competitive debate to have some system for scoring the quality of the contributions, because there is often this element of competition. But then we'd also probably ask the audience to cast a vote on the substantive decision about whether the motion stands or falls. So these are often referred to as parliamentary debates, and they'd start with a motion, "this house believes," and if we're using the example that we were drawing on in the first part of the lecture, we could have a motion that says "this house believes the British government has to take responsibility for the bloodshed caused by partition," but we might have a completely different motion that the bloodshed caused by partition ultimately reflects the weakness of Gandhi's pacifism. So there are all sorts of different interpretations we can put into this kind of motion. And if you don't want to just have 3 opposition and proposition speakers and a largely passive audience, then you can also set it up like a more traditional Westminster form of parliamentary debate, where you have whole teams on either side, key speakers on the front benches, but opportunities for backbenchers to contribute whenever they feel they have a point or a small speech to make as part of the broader debate. Now, competitive debate has many advantages, and we do need to think about the advantages and disadvantages, not least so we're realistic about what we're going to achieve in our teaching. So the chief advantages of competitive debate are that it's competitive. That often works to motivate children. It's tightly timed, so you know exactly how long it's going to take to get through the speeches, because you have a timekeeper and everyone is briefed as to how long they have for their speeches. There's a clear outcome. There is a winning team and there's a losing team. The motion is carried or it's not, so therefore there's a tight focus. There's a need to practice response to others. So built into this is this notion that someone in the audience or someone on the opposition side could challenge the speaker, and the speaker has to build confidence at responding, what we often call rebuttal. There's a focus on developing an argument and really on structuring an argument, because if you've got 3 speakers speaking for something, they can't all stand up and say the same thing, so they have to think strategically about how they'd organise their points in a big overarching argument. And it's also good for testing out a particular viewpoint. So no one in the class might actually believe for or against the motion. They might have more subtle opinions, but it's useful as an academic enterprise to practice constructing the strongest argument you can for our hypothesis. But the disadvantages are that this tends to focus on beating the competition rather than the pursuit of some truth or objectivity. So, if you're on the proposition side, you are going to argue for the motion, even if you think there are some very strong arguments on the opposition benches. So there's that idea that the strategy of winning is more important than the truth or validity or belief in what you're saying. It can be less active for the audience members, and so you have to bear that in mind and vary roles over time. You don't want to be in the audience the whole time because you do spend a lot of time listening. You can plan for that, you can give them mark sheets, you can give them opportunities to intervene, but nevertheless there's no way around it. The opposition and proposition speakers are much more actively involved than the audience. And because there's this focus on competition, it can promote this obsession with style, of being a slick, competent debater and a good person at rebutting points, rather than a focus on the substance. So all drawbacks that we need to just be aware of. They don't make this an unproductive teaching strategy, but it means that we have to be really realistic what it achieves and what it doesn't achieve. The opposite form of debate is consensus seeking. This would be, instead of this house believes, we might state this as this house resolves. The purpose is to find a resolution that carries the support of as many people in the room as possible. So in a straightforward competitive debate, you just need 50% plus one on your side and you've won. But the best solution is the one that carries most people. There's a focus on redrafting the resolution, so not just stating what you believe and then arguing whether that's right or wrong, but actually keep reworking the wording of the resolution to encourage more people to agree with it. And that means that it's much more active, because it means different teams of people can table amendments and then speak to the amendments and then vote on each amendment, so that the resolution itself kind of emerges through that conversation. So it's much more of a universally active approach to debate, and we might set the classroom up a bit more like this, rather than people opposing each other and having to take up an opposition. This kind of structure of the classroom would encourage people to see themselves as members of a debating group rather than in two big tribes, the for or against group. So the kinds of activities that draw on this kind of approach are very frequently seen in model UN simulations. So these are often called MUNs or MUNGAs, Model United Nations General Assembly meetings. If you do a Google search for Model UN, you'll find loads of organisations who put resources and blog about their experience of doing Model UN activities. So the Model UN activities are interesting because they focus on this kind of deliberative approach rather than a straightforward competitive approach to debating. There's a formula for drafting resolutions. So there's a preamble and then operative clauses. So the preamble is things that would start off a UN charter using phrases like recognising that mass social disruption is likely to result from the partition of India, acknowledging the concerns of many Muslim nationalists. These are just setting out the shared understanding that sets the scene for the operative clauses, which are what this meeting resolves to do. So we might start off with a statement that says, recognising and acknowledging these things, we resolve to avoid partition of India, and would then go on to explain how that would be achieved. So there's one website at the bottom here that I've suggested you have a look at for some vocabulary and some sentence starters for putting together the preamble and the operative clauses. The advantage of this kind of debate are that it leaves the whole debate more open to other lines of argument. We're not looking at for and against, we're looking for the whole range of different opinions that people might adopt. So we're avoiding this simplistic binary yes or no, for or against. It encourages people to be more creative and exploratory in their thinking. And there's a real focus on trying to accommodate others' opinions. So you might come up with an amendment to a resolution because you think that's a creative way to bring two groups of people with different interests together around one resolution. So it leads to more moderate views and less extreme views around what the solutions might be. But the disadvantages are that this constant looking for a way to bring different opinions together could lead to a temptation just to keep splitting the difference, so we end up with something that no one really agrees with wholeheartedly. It can focus on the process of tabling amendments, voting on amendments, changing the wording, rather than the substantive content. And it's also susceptible to the emergence of groupthink. So if people very readily agree on something, then that could mean that the debate doesn't really seek that full exploratory discursive understanding that you really are after. So for that reason, you need to think very carefully about the kind of the kind of resolution that you put forward, because you do want children to have to wrangle with one another over the wording and the precise wording of those clauses. Now, the other thing to say is that we can use role play as a way to kind of layer in complexity to either of those debates. So we can assign speakers general roles in relation to the motion. For example, in competitive debates, we just tell people who's going to be for or against. You can assign them specific roles in relation to the motion. For example, in the Model UN type model, you give people countries and country briefings, and they have to represent their interests. And then you can also assign more specific individual or group roles with briefings, with possible lines of argument. For example, if one group were representing Muhammad Ali Jinnah, one group were representing Mahatma Gandhi, then you would give them the briefing for that. So when we're talking about roles, we can be talking about a range of different things, but it's useful to think about how are we setting this debate up and what kind of roles would be significant. If we're setting this up as a simulated town meeting to talk about a local historical issue, or a history conference where we're taking up the views of different historians with their own professional interpretations, or we're in a campaign meeting where we need to come up with different political interpretations, or a trial, we could put a famous person on trial, or a parliamentary debate, or a MUN debate, to Model United Nations activity. The kinds of roles that are relevant to that form of debate and the kind of context that we're developing will be different. So it's really important to think about not just how you'll use the roles, but what kind of roles will open up the most interesting avenues of thinking and debate in the classroom. So in summary, in this middle part of the lecture, I've just wanted to get us to this point really, that we're clear that we need to have a very distinctive and coherent purpose to our teaching, and that could be historical empathy, historical interpretations, or ethical thinking. That we're equally clear of what kind of form will lend itself best to that purpose. That we'll have a competitive debate and then deal with the risk of polarising the positions. We'll have a deliberative debate and then deal with the risk of an overt consensus emerging too readily. And to what extent will we just let people respond, and to what extent will we give them roles and encourage a form of role-playing debate in which we can encourage an empathetic engagement with the evidence and the arguments. So these are all decisions that need to be made, and then deciding on whether children adopt a role that you've given them or develop their own view is important, because it shifts the balance in terms of the emotional content of the lesson. So if this is a very controversial topic, you may want to assign people roles so that their own emotions don't get in the way. But on other occasions, you might want children to use the debate as a way to stake out what they really think themselves about a topic, in which case you want them to find the right side that represents their interests. So these decisions have a potentially significant bearing on the emotional content, and therefore the kind of experience that children are going to have. So having said that about form, we'll move on now and look at some of the really kind of micro practical points to consider when you're planning a debate lesson.